There are betrayals that explode, and then there are betrayals that arrive in an envelope. No lies, no money stolen, no rules broken, just a wedding invitation from my twin brother, and the bride was the one person he knew I could never forgive. People like to romanticize twins. They say it with a smile, like it's something magical. You must be so close. You probably read each other's minds. What they really mean is trust, the kind that doesn't need to be explained, the kind you don't question because it's always been there. We grew up side by side. Same house, same schools, same circle of friends. Sometimes even the same clothes, not because we wanted to be identical, but because it was easier. No one ever made a big deal out of it. Neither did we. There was never a conversation about loyalty between us. It didn't need one. It was just understood. When I fell in love for the first time, he was the first person I told.
Not because I needed advice or reassurance or someone to tell me I was making the right choice. I told him because it felt natural, because with him I didn't feel the need to hold anything back. I trusted him without thinking about it. That kind of trust is quiet. You don't notice it while it's there. That relationship meant more to me than I ever admitted, even to myself. I didn't talk about it much. I didn't dramatize it, but it mattered deeply. And when it ended, it didn't end with a fight or a clear breaking point. It ended quietly. The kind of ending where nothing explodes, no one raises their voice, but something important is lost anyway. You wake up the next day and everything looks the same, except it doesn't feel the same anymore. And that ache lingers longer than you expect. He knew that. He saw what it cost me.
He was there when I stopped talking about it, not because it stopped hurting, but because I didn't know how to explain the kind of pain that doesn't have sharp edges. And because he was my brother, because he was my twin, I trusted that certain lines would never even come close to being crossed. Not because we talked about it, not because we set rules, but because some things felt so obvious they didn't need to be said. That was the rule between us, unspoken, unwritten, and for a long time it worked. I felt safe in that certainty, safe in the belief that there were things neither of us would ever do, simply because we knew better, because we cared enough not to test it. I never imagined that line could shift. Not quietly, not without warning, and definitely not while I was still standing on the other side of it, assuming it was exactly where it had always been. The first sign didn't come as a confession.
There was no warning, no awkward conversation, no moment where he sat me down and said we needed to talk. It was silence. At first, it was easy to miss. He just changed slightly. He stopped asking about my life the way he used to. The casual check-ins disappeared. The small questions that meant more than they seemed were suddenly gone. And when her name came up, something felt different. Not tense, not uncomfortable, just absent. The reactions I expected never came. The hesitation, the pause, the subtle signal that told me a line still existed. He didn't look uneasy in the moments where he probably should have. I noticed it, but I didn't want to believe it meant anything. So I told myself I was overthinking, that I was projecting old emotions onto new situations, that time had passed and people move on, that we grow up, mature, learn how to coexist with our past instead of being defined by it. And maybe that's true. Maybe people do move on.
They just don't always move away from the same places. What stayed with me later on wasn't what he did, it was what he never did. He never asked how I'd feel, never checked whether that old wound had actually healed or if it was just something I'd learned to live around. He never said, "Hey, this might be hard to hear, but I want to talk to you about something." There was no conversation, no acknowledgement, no space made from my side of it. Because the truth is, he didn't need to ask. He already knew. He knew what that relationship had been to me. He knew how it ended.
He knew the kind of pain that doesn't show up in dramatic ways, but stays quietly in the background, shaping how you trust people afterward. And he made the choice anyway. That's the part people don't like to talk about. We prefer to imagine betrayal as something loud, something cruel, something done with intention to hurt. But it doesn't always look like that. Sometimes it comes from comfort.
From someone deciding that their happiness matters more than the discomfort of addressing your pain. From choosing the option that requires the least resistance, the least explanation, the least emotional labor. And sometimes betrayal isn't about doing something wrong. It's about hoping the person you hurt will stay quiet enough to make it easier. Not because they don't know, but because they don't want to face what they already understand. And in that silence, a choice is made long before anyone ever admits it out loud. The envelope itself didn't stand out. It was plain, almost deliberately so. No handwriting, no personal note tucked inside. Just my name printed cleanly on the front, as if that alone was enough to say everything. I didn't open it right away. I told myself it was because I was busy or distracted, but that wasn't the truth. Some part of me already knew what was inside, and when you sense something like that, you don't rush toward it.
You let it sit there a little longer, hoping that somehow the meaning might change if you don't look at it yet. There's a pattern you start to recognize as you get older. When someone avoids a difficult conversation long enough, it's usually because they're preparing to replace it with an announcement. Something final. Something you're expected to accept without discussion. Eventually, I opened it. Inside was exactly what you'd expect. The date, the venue, carefully chosen fonts. The words "Save the Date" centered neatly at the top, like a headline meant to soften the blow. And then her name. It wasn't explained. There was no acknowledgement of what that name might mean to me. No attempt to ease the moment or frame it as a conversation that should have happened earlier. It was simply there, presented as a fact. As if facts don't carry weight just because they're printed neatly on thick paper. That's when something clicked. He didn't forget what she was to me.
He didn't misunderstand the history we shared or how that chapter ended. This wasn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment. It was a decision. He decided it was easier to let me take in the shock on my own than to sit across from me and deal with the discomfort of saying it out loud. Easier to mail the truth than to speak it. Easier to let the invitation do the work of the conversation he never wanted to have. In that moment, the wedding stopped being about love or celebration or starting a new life together. It became something else entirely. It became a test, not of loyalty or family or forgiveness in the way people usually mean it, but of how much silence I was willing to accept in order to keep things calm. How much of my own reaction I was expected to swallow so that no one else would have to feel uneasy. The invitation wasn't asking for my support, it was asking for my compliance. And the hardest part wasn't the news itself. It was realizing that my role in all of this had already been assigned to me, quietly, without my consent. All I had to do was decide whether I was going to play it. People tend to imagine that saying no is always loud, that it comes with raised voices, long explanations, maybe even a fight. Something dramatic enough that everyone knows exactly where you stand. This wasn't like that. There was no confrontation, no emotional speech, no moment where I rehearsed what I was going to say in my head 100 times before saying it out loud. The decision didn't arrive with a surge of confidence. It arrived quietly, after everything else had already settled. I picked up the invitation again, not because I was reconsidering. That part was already done. I read it again because I wanted to be clear about what it was really asking of me. It wasn't just asking me to attend. It was asking me to stand beside him, to smile for the photos, to pose in a way that suggested everything made sense, to act as if the past had been neatly erased instead of carefully avoided. That's when I realized I didn't need to argue. There was nothing to debate, no misunderstanding to clear up. Explaining my pain in detail wouldn't have changed the situation, and it wouldn't have made me feel more heard. It would have only turned my boundary into something that needed to be negotiated. And that wasn't what this was. I wasn't trying to convince him of anything. I wasn't looking for validation, or an apology, or even understanding in the way people usually expect. What I was trying to do was stay honest with myself, to respond in a way that didn't require me to perform emotional gymnastics just to keep things comfortable. So I declined. Not as a statement, not as a punishment, not as a way to make anyone feel guilty. I declined because standing there would have meant pretending I was okay with something I wasn't.
It would have meant smiling through a moment that asked me to deny a part of my own history. And no matter how calmly I imagined myself doing it, it would have been a lie. The response wasn't anger. That surprised me. It was confusion. You're really not coming? The question wasn't sharp or accusatory. It was almost genuinely puzzled, like the idea hadn't fully registered yet, as if my decision didn't make sense unless everyone agreed it did. That's when I understood something else. Boundaries are easy to respect when they align with what people already want. They only become complicated when they create discomfort, when they force someone to sit with a choice they'd rather not examine too closely. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make demands. I just didn't show up. And somehow that quiet refusal said more than any argument ever could. The wedding went on without me. I didn't hear about it directly.
I saw it the same way everyone else did, through photos that started appearing online. Smiles frozen in place, carefully chosen angles, people standing close together, looking relaxed, like nothing unusual had happened at all. And that was the strange part. Nothing looked wrong. When you step away quietly, the world doesn't stop to ask why. There's no pause, no moment of collective confusion. Things don't collapse or fall apart. They just adjust, as if your absence was always a possible outcome, even if no one said it out loud. No one called to ask what went wrong, not because they didn't care, but because nothing on the surface had actually gone wrong. There was no argument to reference, no dramatic fallout, no single moment that could be pointed to and labeled as the problem. Without something obvious to react to, people defaulted to moving on. It was easier that way. I noticed how quickly the silence settled in. Messages slowed down. Conversations became lighter, safer.
The kind that stays on the surface, where nothing personal ever really has to be addressed. No one brought up the wedding directly. No one asked how I felt about it. And I didn't offer. That silence felt familiar. I'd lived with it before. For a long time, I'd learned how to tolerate discomfort by staying quiet, by convincing myself that if I didn't make things awkward, everything would eventually smooth itself out. That patience was the same thing as maturity, that letting things go meant I was taking the high road. But this time, something was different. It wasn't anger that followed the wedding. It wasn't resentment either. It was clarity, a subtle shift in how I understood my own limits. I realized that what I had stepped away from wasn't just an event. It was a pattern I'd grown used to accepting. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt honest. Not between them, between me and myself. I started noticing the moments where I used to stay quiet automatically, where I used to minimize my own reaction just to keep things easy. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to do that. Not out of spite, not to prove a point, just because I didn't need to anymore. The wedding came and went. Life moved forward. Nothing publicly changed, but I did. Not in a way anyone else could measure or comment on, just in the way I understood what I was willing to accept going forward. The silence I used to tolerate had lost its power over me. And sometimes that's all that really changes. People say things like family is everything, usually with good intentions. It sounds comforting, like something solid you can lean on. But what they often mean, without realizing it, is that family should be forgiven more easily, that certain things should be overlooked because of who they come from. What rarely gets said is how often that idea is used to excuse behavior that wouldn't be acceptable from anyone else. The same actions, the same choices, suddenly feel different once you attach the word family to them. Not every relationship ends with an argument or a clear breaking point. Some end much more quietly. They end with understanding, with the realization that you don't need a confrontation to see what something really is. Certain choices speak for themselves. They show you where you stand without anyone having to explain it. I didn't stop the wedding. I didn't try to interfere or change anyone's mind. I just didn't show up. And sometimes that quiet decision is the most honest response you can give. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's not an accident. It's what happens when silence finally gets questioned.